Hello my beautiful watchers and welcome to Lost in Adaptation. This is a review show that explores the differences between film adaptations and the books they're based on. Please keep in mind that comparing plots requires me to describe them in detail, so consider this the spoileriest of spoiler warnings. Alright, so I have been receiving requests for holes for the better part of a decade now, and now that I've finally read it, I have to say I was a little surprised. From the way that fans described it to me, as a teen forced to dig holes every day as part of a juvenile punitive program and slowly realizing there's much more to what he's doing than just punishment, I was expecting something much darker. I really thought that these holes were going to turn out to be a part of some sort of Lovecraftian ritual that would bring about the end of the world or something crazy like that. So after all that build-up, discovering that the big reveal was some greedy arseholes were using child labor to look for buried treasure was honestly something of a relief. Afterwards, I realized that the people who were talking about it in such hushed tones were the people who had read it as a kid, and yeah, for a kid's novel, it is definitely on the darker side. I can totally see how they ended up remembering it as being quite thrilling to read. Anyways, Holes, published in 1998, is the work of American author Louis Sachar. It's one of 42 novels that Mr. Sachar has written in his time, though it's viewed as a bit of a departure from the rest of his work, which usually tends to be more conventional young adult literature, i.e. blatant child abuse and misery don't feature quite so heavily. Themes of the book include the inherent immorality of America's incarceration system, modern slavery, racism, wealth inequality, misery, fate, and friendship. All in about 250 pages or so. It is not a long book, but he crams a lot into it. Sachar's career as an author took a little while to build up steam, as his first few publications undersold somewhat. However, by 1998 his talent was more appreciated, and Holes earned him the US National Book Award for Young People's Literature and the Newbery Medal for the year's most distinguished contribution to American literature for children. A few years later, director Andrew Davis, known for films like Collateral Damage and Under Siege, allegedly decided to prove to the world that he could direct more than just cheesy action films and chose Holes as his example. Personally, I would have thought The Fugitive would have served, but maybe he wanted to prove that wasn't just a fluke. Richard Kelly, the writer behind Donnie Darko, was initially hired to write the screenplay, but his first draft proved extremely unpopular with the production staff. Apparently, it was much darker than the book, set in a post-apocalyptic wasteland, and, as they described it, insane. Like, it was apparently so nuts they didn't even let him do another draft. They were just like, dude, you gotta go, you gotta leave, no, you gotta go. Which is hilarious and kind of ironic, because it means that Kelly wrote the kind of story that I was expecting from the book. Anyways, after firing Kelly's ass, Davis had the bright idea to replace him with Sachar himself, figuring he would probably be the best person to adapt his own book. The two of them then storyboarded most of the film together, meticulously planning the timing of each scene to create an ideal pacing for a film while remaining true to the book's plot. Extensive consideration went into the leading role of Stanley Yelnats, and they eventually landed on Shia LaBeouf back when he was still starring in the hit comedy show Even Stevens, and long before he would grow up to be a violent domestic abuser. You know, I don't enjoy killing the vibe of my videos by mentioning when people are terrible, so if everyone could just stop being terrible, that would be just so great. Thanks. Preach. Other notable cast members included Sigourney Weaver, Jon Voight, Eartha Kitt, Tim Blake Nelson, Dule Hill, and Patricia Arquette. The deadly yellow-spotted lizards of the story were portrayed by a collection of bearded dragons with a little splash of paint on them. Most of the time anyway. When they needed them to be aggressive, they were replaced by some very unfortunate low-budget CGI. So, did bringing the author on board pay off? Let's talk adaptation. Camp Green Lake itself is pretty spot on, though it's a big empty spot in the desert with lots of holes dug in it. It's not a complicated requirement. In said camp, incarcerated youths are forced to dig a hole every day that is 5 foot wide and 5 foot deep, using a 5-foot shovel as a measuring stick, supposedly as a form of rehabilitation. One such prisoner, nicknamed Barfbag, cannot take the torture of this daily hard labor anymore and intentionally subjects himself to a rattlesnake bite, so he'll be taken away to hospital. Meanwhile, a young man man by the name of Stanley Yelnats IV is struck on the head by some sports shoes that fell from an overpass. Stanley's family history, summarized in both narration and the ramblings of an eccentric relative, is almost perfectly book accurate. Stanley's great-great-grandfather, a Latvian peasant named Elya, had entered into an agreement with a Romani traveler called Madame Zeroni because he was in love with a woman but needed a larger pig than his rather gross rival to give to her father as a bribe for his blessing. Madame Zeroni gave him one of her own and told him to perform a ritual to make it big and strong that involved carrying it up a mountain to drink from a stream every day. As payment, Elya agreed that afterwards he would carry Madame Zeroni up the mountain so she could drink from the stream and become big and strong. While the pig almost gets Elya what he wanted, his would-be intended's inability to immediately choose between him and an ugly middle-aged man bums him out so much he gives up on her and runs away to America, only remembering after leaving that he hadn't kept up his end of the bargain and earning a curse on him and all of his descendants from Madame Zeroni. Despite claiming to not believe in the curse, Stanley has noticed that bad luck has followed him and his entire family around for generations. Like his great-grandfather losing his entire fortune when he was robbed by a famous outlaw called Kissin' Kate, and spending a week lost in a desert on something he referred to as the Thumb of God. Not believing in the curse also doesn't protect Stanley from being arrested for stealing these sky-delivered shoes, as it turns out they were donated by a famous baseball player to be auctioned off to save a homeless shelter. Stanley's obvious obsession with the player and his father's obvious obsession with trying to find a way to restore old shoes inclines a judge to find him guilty despite no other conclusive evidence, and as an added negative bonus, Stanley's hero now thinks he's trash who steals from the homeless. The judge gives Stanley a choice between jail or attending Camp Green Lake, and Stanley chooses the camp, incorrectly assuming that it was an actual lake and not a dried up wasteland. He is driven there in a dusty old bus and introduced to the staff, a guard who insists on being called Mr. Sir and eats a bag of sunflower seeds every day to help him give up smoking, and a counselor called Dr. Pendansky who affects a friendly demeanor but is just as cruel and manipulative as everyone else. Mr. Sir explains to Stanley that he'll be building character by digging a hole every day and makes a point of showing him that the camp has no walls or fences or even a lot of staff, as escape is made impossible by the endless scorching desert that extends in every direction for hundreds of miles and would guarantee death by dehydration in mere days. Stanley then meets his cellmates, all of whom go by Big House nicknames. X-Ray, who is inexplicably the top dog of the group despite not being the biggest and having terrible eyesight, and Armpit, Zigzag, Magnet, and Zero. Zero is considered to be an idiot by all because he barely talks and is illiterate, but after watching Stanley writing a letter to his mother lying about how nice the camp is, he eventually asks him to teach him to read and write, which forms a close friendship between them. While initially hazed and bullied by the other boys, Stanley eventually gains enough acceptance from them to earn his own nickname, as they dub him Caveman to imply that he's tougher than he actually is and discourage other people from picking on him. Digging is terrible and backbreaking, and the staff make the suspicious demand that any interesting finds be reported to them. Stanley eventually finds a mysterious gold tube, but is bullied into giving it to X-Ray so that he can receive the reward for its discovery the next day. The guards are extremely excited about it, and the mysterious warden of the camp, a beautiful redhead, turns up and orders the surrounding area, which is the wrong place because of the delay in reporting it, be extensively excavated. During all this, flashbacks throughout the film slowly unravel the history of Green Lake and the true purpose of all this bloody hole digging. Kissin' Kate, the outlaw who robbed Stanley's ancestor, was once a school teacher who fell in love with Sam, a local black onion seller and handyman, but after the town's racist owner leads a mob to murder him, she turns highwayman and murderer. God also apparently wished to punish the town for Sam's death, so any and all rain stopped the day that he died and the lake dried up, causing its owner to go bankrupt. He attempts to regain his wealth by capturing Kate and demanding to know where she buried her loot, but Kate is fatally bitten by a poisonous yellow-spotted lizard native to the area before she can reveal anything. Generations later, his descendant, the warden, is still trying to find it by digging up the entire lake bed, utilizing underage prison labor after a lifetime of being forced to do it herself, which is somewhat tragic but did give the world this wonderful meme.
I'm tired of this, Grandpa!
That's too damn bad!
The warden proved to be a tad unstable, punishing Mr. Sir by inflicting snake venom-infused nail polish on him for daring to bother her with minor disciplinary issues. Eventually, when Zigzag picks on Stanley one too many times, Zero attacks him in defense of his new friend, and a big fight breaks out. When this leads to his extracurricular learning to be banned, Zero snaps and runs off into the desert. As Zero was a homeless kid who had been separated from his mother years before, the warden orders all records of him to be destroyed to cover up his inevitable death. Desperate to save his friend, Stanley steals the water truck but crashes it into a hole almost immediately, so is forced to run off into the desert after him waterless. After a hard trek through the searing heat, Stanley finds Zero hiding under an old overturned boat that the audience will recognize as Sam's. Realizing they can't survive long out there, Stanley recalls his family lore and remembers the thumb of God his great-grandfather mentioned would be around here somewhere, and realizes it's a local mountain. When he carries Zero up it to find water, it's revealed, to the watcher at least, that Zero is the descendant of Madame Zeroni and the curse has now been broken. Without colossal bad luck holding him back, Stanley finds Sam's long-lost onion farm that's been growing wild in the mountain ever since his death and feasts on their vegetable goodness. No longer in immediate danger of painful death, the boys decide to sneak back into the camp and surreptitiously dig in the hole where the gold was actually discovered so they can claim the treasure for themselves. They unearth an ancient briefcase just before being ambushed by the warden and her cronies, who attempt to take them captive but stop when they realize the boys have unwittingly stepped into a hole full of deadly yellow-spotted lizards. Atypically not biting the kids, the lizards hold the bad guys off until morning, when a lawyer arrives at camp with the authorities and reveals that, just as Stanley was breaking the family curse, his father had invented a revolutionary new foot odor repellent, become super rich, and had hired her to clear his son's name, which she had now done. As the warden had erased Zero, real name Hector's file, she can't stop him from being rescued too, and they leave together. They even get to take the briefcase with them because it has Stanley's name on it, because his ancestor was also called Stanley. You know, he's the fourth. They named all their kids Stanley because it's Yelnats backwards, which, now that I think about it, Yelnats isn't really a Latvian name, but I guess it's kind of a funny joke. Anyway, the briefcase turns out to be full of gems and bank bonds. Stanley's name is cleared, Zero uses his share of the loot to reunite with his mother, Stanley's baseball hero accepts his innocence and starts advertising for his dad's new foot spray, and Green Lake is shut down and converted into a Girl Scout camp. With one notable exception, the entire cast was perfectly chosen to match their book counterparts in looks and mannerisms. The warden was especially well handled, as the film stuck to the way that she was treated as a dark, mysterious, unseen figure until about halfway through the story, and then constantly subverting expectations, first by being a beautiful woman, then by being a terrifying, violent sadist who will disfigure her own henchmen without hesitation just for being annoying, including her habit of saying "excuse me" in a way that makes it very clear that she's actually saying "bitch, you fucked up" was a nice touch. Sachar mentioned this was based on an actual teacher he once had, which is pretty funny. The film ties the main storyline and the multiple flashbacks together, and the way that the events of the past constantly inform the present about as well as the book did. That's to say, not perfectly, because there is no completely seamless way to suddenly take a break from the main plot to tell a completely different one, then drop back into the modern day storyline, but it's reasonably good at not decimating the pacing. I'm pleased my personal favourite moment from the book was included. During the climax, while surrounded by armed murderous thugs and covered in aggressive venomous lizards, newly literate Hector suddenly realizes that Stanley's last name is his first name backwards and can't resist commenting on it. So yeah, it's pretty fucking accurate to the book. Anyone who'd seen the film recently probably felt a tad bored there at having the entire plot narrated back to them in a British accent. But of course, with Sachar in the writer's seat, similarities to the book aren't particularly surprising. What's more unexpected is... So, funny story. Despite the exact measurements of the holes being a semi-important plot point in the book, during filming the amusing discovery was made that it is not in fact physically possible to dig a hole that is 5 foot deep and 5 foot wide using a 5-foot shovel, because the shovel being as wide as the hole means there will never be enough space to toss the dirt out of it as they dig it. It's one of those things that's bleeding obvious in hindsight, but, you know, Didn't occur to me while I was reading the book either, so I'm not going to say nothing. Anyway, the point is, every hole in the Holes film is somewhat bigger than described in the book. There's a tonal shift between the book and the film. It's not drastic, but I would still say the film is recognizably lighter-hearted. Just how physically grueling digging the holes is for Stanley is played down. By the end of his first day in the book, his hands were literally staining his clothing red with blood, and his body was so wrecked by the hardship of digging in the rock-hard earth all day, he didn't have the strength to pull himself out of his hole. It's hard for this scene in the film to convey the same sense of pain and suffering while LaBeouf hams it up and a tuba is playing him off. There's also a much greater sense of menace and danger from the adults of the camp in written form. Mr. Sir in particular gives off the impression he might genuinely be capable and indeed often on the edge of committing violent acts towards the children. While the character engages in almost all of the same activities as his book counterpart, Jon Voight was very clearly directed to do so in a goofy and comedic way, eliminating any intimidation he might have had. The only character who maintained any of their original presence was the Warden, because Sigourney Weaver always fucking brings it. A minor difference in the way the story is presented is the order in which you learn certain information. The book starts with Stanley on the prison bus arriving at Camp Green Lake, and things like the fate of Bathbag and the rattlesnake, the shoes falling on Stanley's head from the overpass and his subsequent trial are either revealed in dialogue or cut back to later as he remembers them. You also find out things like who Hector really was and how that broke the curse post hoc. The film returns this stuff to chronological order, which most of the time doesn't affect its impact on the plot. An interesting exception I picked up on was in the climax, when the yellow spotted lizards didn't attack Stanley and Zero despite crawling all over them. The film drops the tidbit that the lizards never bite people who have been eating onions before this scene. The book did it afterwards. This struck me as one of the film's rare mistakes because it missed out on the confused tension of not knowing why they were being spared at the time or how long this inexplicable immunity would last, as well as a satisfactory "oh" moment when it was revealed later. The film adds a new character in the form of Stanley's eccentric grandfather, who appears to mostly be there to exposition dump a lot of the family's long-term crazy history. As a method of converting narrative to dialogue, he works pretty well, and yeah, I guess he's an amusing addition to the cast. The before-mentioned exception to the physically accurate to the book rule was the main man, Stanley himself. Book Stanley was, well, quite large, not just overweight, but also very tall for his age. Stanley then lost considerable weight throughout the book due to all the grueling exercise and limited food. The idea of trying to replicate this in the film was dismissed early in the writing process for being wildly impractical and potentially unhealthy, which I think was the right call, though they could have worded it a little better.
Finding a chubby boy that could then toughen up and lose weight was, virtually impossible to ask of a teenager.
Speaking as someone who was an overweight teenager, I always detested the word chubby. Okay, so it's a well-known hardship in adaptations that certain things are extremely easy to describe in a book, but can be a lot harder to recreate visually, even using special effects. This often especially applies to landscapes and natural objects. It's a hard task. That said, I do wonder if this film might have benefited from a little more effort being put into their attempts to recreate the mountain known as the Thumb of God. The thumb. The thumb of God. The thumb of God. The thumb of God? Anyways, a character omitted from the film was Stanley's pre-arrest bully. He was a small but mean kid who stole his notebook and threw it in the toilet. There's a bit of a twist at the end because it turns out this little asshole is the reason that Stanley is let out of jail, as he testified that he was bullying him at the time the shoes were stolen. It's an odd redemption arc, but I'm kind of into it. While the suitcase full of treasure was indeed a suitcase full of treasure in the book, it specifically mentioned that it wasn't as impressive as it first seemed because all the jewels were of a low quality and the bonds weren't all that valuable anymore. It was still nearly $1 million worth of loot for both Stanley and Hector, but this twist added a level of irony to the entire story because that's like, You know, it's a life-changing amount for a regular person, but it's not a generational wealth-restoring amount. Even if the warden had gotten to keep it, it wouldn't have justified a century's worth of her family spending their entire lives searching for it. Now, this might have just been a slight failure of imagination on my part, but I think the sheer scale of the holes-digging project could only have been portrayed properly in the visual medium of a film. You can't exactly pan the camera up in a book, and Stanley didn't get a good look at the lake bed from anything other than ground level. The movie has a slightly more satisfying ending as the warden and her henchmen are arrested for their abuse of children. In the book, she didn't face any legal ramifications, just eventual financial destitution. But then again, that satisfaction comes at the cost of one of the more poignant messages of the book, the critique of prison labor. One of the things I found most genuinely terrifying about the Holes book was the nefarious schemes of the villains would not have actually been technically illegal in the real-life American criminal justice system. Let that thought fester in your noodles. Final thoughts. Holes had the distinct advantage over other adaptations in that it was adapting a relatively short book, removing the need to cut or compromise on any significant scenes, plot points, or characters, and change the remainder to compensate for their loss. Sachar's writing also converted well, as it was very descriptive and action-orientated. Stanley's nature and thought processes were usually revealed through his spoken words and actions, rather than from long internal monologues. Most of what did go on inside his head was remembering his personal and family history regarding bad luck, which was covered in LaBeouf's opening narration pretty effectively. This means the only reason for there to be any significant changes would be the writer having a different vision for the story, but unlike our boy Rick Riordan, Sachar evidently hadn't become obsessed with improving his own work by the time of the adaptation. So the pitfalls of hiring the author were avoided, and the film worked amazingly well as a film and as an adaptation. Thank you for joining me, my beautiful watchers. I'm aware that my release schedule has been a little slow and erratic recently. I'm trying to get a handle on that, I promise. The good news is, if you get bored waiting for the next video to drop on YouTube, you can avail yourself of my Patreon page, on which there's dozens of exclusive videos, including, but not limited to, the Lost in adaptation about what they did to the Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes by Susan Collins. So consider this the Newbery Medal for the year's most distinguished contribution to American literature for children. Damn it! Unlike our boy Sateri. Hello. Oh, you just had to come and distract me at least once before the end of the video, huh? Yeah. I love you so much. Cat hair in the mouth.